Through human infirmity, they were liable to indiscretions and false steps, and were sometimes betrayed into errors by the malignant stratagems of papists and prelatists. These, however, they were not ashamed publicly to confess, and they never took repose till evils were purged out, and barriers raised to prevent their recurrence. The courage and fidelity with which, despite the royal authority and in the prospect of dungeons and death, the Assembly in 1638 tried, convicted, and censured the bishops, 14 in number, is matter of national history. The greater part of them were sentenced to be deposed, and several subjected to the greater excommunication, furnishing an example of stern fidelity and discipline, never surpassed, unless perhaps at Torwood in 1680, by the individual act of the only remaining public representative of the covenanted uniformity in Britain. It is true that some curates were received into the church then, as well as at the Revolution. There were, however, but a few of these with one bishop, and before being admitted to ministerial communion, they had to own the evil of abjured prelacy and formally renounce it, subscribe the national covenant, as explained by the Assembly in 1638 and 1639, and actually embrace the Reformation principles. Here a footnote. Act Annette receiving of deposed ministers, sessions 20 and 28, August 1639. Quote, "The General Assembly do make this general act, recommending to the synods all those who are deposed before them for subscribing of the declinature, and reading the service book, and for no other gross cause, that upon their true repentance and submission to the constitutions of this kirk, and upon their purgation, and clearness from any gross faults laid to their charge in any new process against them, they may be found by the synods capable of the ministry." Unquote. After these 2 years at the beginning, there is not to be found on all the records of church or state during the progress or continuance of the Second Reformation one word tolerating or establishing a single curate in any parish throughout the Scottish churchdom. That, from Plain Reasons, page 195. Without very considerable research and intimate acquaintance with the Acts of Assembly and records of the parishes 1638 through 1649, it is impossible to have any proper idea of the extent, minuteness, and vigor of that holy discipline which, without partiality or favoritism, was then made to bear upon men in every rank, the highest nobles of the land not excepted. That important part of ancient discipline, presbyterial visitation of parishes, was duly observed, and none who avowed heretical opinions or indulged in immoral practices were tolerated in the church. Deputations were sent through the north and other suspected districts, and many such were deposed. The Parliament ordained all ministers, etc., to take and subscribe the covenants, as the proper pledge of allegiance to the civil government prescribed by law. And here a footnote. See the 5th Act of Parliament 1640 and the 5th Act of Parliament 1644. Those who maintained a malignant opposition to the religion and liberties of the nation, as then established, were excluded from the places of power and trust in the state, fleet, and army. And the very soldiers were patterns of piety and godliness, as well as of temperance and sobriety. The tide of public opinion was turned very strongly against every kind of sin and vice, and all strove to avoid the odium and humiliating discredit of falling under the censures of the Church. From a state of great turmoil and insubordination, the people were gradually brought under the salutary restraints of religion, morality, and law, and trained to, quote, "lead quiet and peaceable lives in all godliness and honesty," unquote. Thus, scriptural discipline, faithfully exercised, was the happy and honored instrument in forming the high and enviable character of the Scottish population, investing with a moral halo the ingenium perfidium scotorum, which they still in some measure retain throughout the civilized world. This complex objection, then, is perfectly irrelevant and inconclusive. Objection number 2. It is further urged that such a rigorous system of discipline would drive people away from communion, lessen and keep the church small, and harden offenders by inducing them to abandon the means of salvation. It is the very use of the fan to purge the floor by blowing off the chaff. With this special end in view, Christ takes it into his hand and commits its exercise to responsible officers, and the diminution produced by such an operation must, from analogy, be advantageous. When, by purgative appliances, the animal body is made to throw off indolent and peccant humors, it surely cannot be the worse for it. The vital principle will act with more freedom and vigor when they are gone. What it loses is crassitude, is more than compensated by increment of health and muscular power. It is infinitely better for the church to have, were it only one half table, say 50, or even a score of worthy communicants, than hundreds crowded by ignorance, graceless people who have no perceptible title to the ordinance and can only eat and drink judgment to themselves. That proper discipline is injurious. To the growth of the church is a mistake. The contrary, we have already seen, is clearly the case. Even that extraordinary act of discipline, if so it may be termed, which the apostles exercised on Ananias and Sapphira, by which all the people were struck with awful consternation, is particularly observed to have contributed largely to the growth of the church. After reciting the tragic story, it is added, quote, "Great fear came upon the churches, and upon as many as heard these things," unquote. And though on this account the wicked and insincere dared not unite themselves, yet on that occasion, quote, "believers were the more added to the church, multitudes both of men and women," unquote. Here a footnote, that from Acts 5, verses 11, 13, and 14. If such were the effects of this extraordinary act of discipline at the first collecting of the Christian church, we need not surely be afraid of its ordinary exercise ruining her increase now. And here a footnote. It is said by Mr. Edwards in his treatise on, quote, "Communion in the Visible Church," unquote, quote, "Some have made another objection, that the way I plead for tends to keep the Church of Christ small and hinder the growth of it, whereas I think the contrary tends to keep it small, as it is the wickedness of its members that, above all things in the world, prejudices mankind against it, and is the chief stumbling block that hinders the propagation of Christianity, and so the growth of the Christian church. But holiness would cause the light of the church to shine, so as to induce others to resort to it," unquote. With respect to its supposed hardening tendency upon delinquents, who may thereby be led to forsake the means of grace, it is sufficient to remark that, being an ordinance of Christ, the last mean which can be used for reclaiming such, the criminal neglect rather than the faithful exercise of it may be expected to have the effect of confirming in wickedness. But though, in the pride and stubbornness of his heart, the sinner should disregard the benefits which accrue from discipline when submitted to in a becoming spirit, the rulers of the church are not to be deterred from discharging their duty, any more than the minister of the world from preaching, because many turn a deaf ear to all that he says, become more obdurate, and have their guilt and danger proportionately augmented. The maxim ought never to be forgotten, quote, though ruin should ensue, let justice take its course," unquote. Jude says, quote, "These be they who separate themselves, having not the Spirit," unquote. Quote, "They went out from us," says John, "but they were not of us," unquote. And Paul tells the Corinthians, "To the one we are the savor of death unto death, and to the other the savor of life unto life." Objection number 3. It is also objected, the admission of others to communion is no concern of ours, however unworthy, they only injure their own souls, quote, "eat and drink judgment to themselves," unquote. The nature of the Lord's Supper and the laws of his house imply the contrary to this. Communion there is not only a social act, a holding fellowship by eating and drinking together, as it is done externally in social prayer, praise, and the hearing of the gospel, but it is in addition and particularly the very act by which the Christian society as such symbolically and professedly declare their mutual connection with each other as members of the body of Christ, 1 Corinthians 10, verses 16 and 17. A believer therefore must contract guilt and deeply injure his own soul by thus uniting with the unbelieving, not under the mask of hypocrisy, but plainly in a state of unregeneracy and impenitence. When he knows, by infallible Scripture marks that this is the case, that a person is living in habits of sin inconsistent with a state of grace or with the character and profession of a Christian, and the exercise of grace at the time, and yet does not, quote, tell it to the church, unquote, he acts an undutiful and sinful part in joining with him. He thereby greatly dishonors the Savior by presumptuously violating his express commands, subverting the constitution of his kingdom, confounding the distinction between it and the world, and retarding the success of the gospel, while in effect it is saying, quote, "Am I my brother's keeper?" and suffering sin upon him, virtually speaking peace, and promising salvation to the wicked, that they may not return and live. This is the naked and undeniable fact, and it is not easy to see how it can be done with safety, without incurring enormous guilt and danger, and sustaining the heaviest personal injury. Quote, "Neither be partakers of other men's sins. Keep thyself pure." Unquote. In coming now to a conclusion, be it observed that while in the preceding discussion I have sometimes been unavoidably led into a rather awkward juxtaposition, or, if you will, into direct collision, such being quite the order of the day with different parties, it has been my constant aim to do injustice to none. In exposing obnoxious principles and practices, I have spoken freely, but I trust honestly and candidly, and in attempting to withstand those who patronize them, quote, because they are to be blamed, unquote, I have guarded against wounding their feelings or personal character. Let all learn to appreciate highly the godly discipline of early times, and exert themselves for its general revival. Quote, "There was nothing," says Dr. Machree in Life of Knox, "in which the Scottish Reformers approached nearer to the primitive church than in the rigorous and impartial exercise of ecclesiastical discipline, the relaxation of which under the papacy they justly regarded as one of the great causes of the universal corruption of religion." Unquote. Even where there were the strongest prudential considerations to induce relaxation, and to act on the principle of expediency or favoritism, they exerted it with vigor and rigid impartiality. Our age is very different. It has the advantage as to refinement, commerce, and the knowledge of sciences and useful arts. But in respect of Christian ethics, or pure and undefiled practical religion, our country has reason to confess, in an unfavorable sense, I am not what I have been. To our fathers the tree of knowledge was the tree of life, which yielded abundantly the fruits of holiness. But now there is a boast of knowledge dissevered from piety, and, as Absalom was hung by the hair of his head, in which he gloried, there is reason to fear unsanctified knowledge of the head will damn many. Quote, "If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them." Unquote. And, quote, "And that servant which knew his Lord's will and prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes." Unquote. The period in which we live is loose and luxurious, not a little resembling the days of Cromwellian license, described by Mr. Andrew Gray in a letter to Lord Warriston, 1656, a little before his death, in these words, quote, "This juncture of time wherein there seems to be a toleration of tongues and lusts and religion." Unquote. In such a time, by a generation, many of whom are gay, silly, butterflies of fashion, impatient of moral restraint, however salutary, it is only to be expected that the ancient Presbyterian discipline be accounted singular and austere, and treated with derision rather than becoming reverence. Many a callow clerical novice and puling babe of literature, who, as Pope defines Entick, the dictionary maker, may possibly understand the meaning of a single word, but certainly not the meaning of two words put together, under the influence of Satanism, get convulsed with sardonic laughter. On hearing mention of the Covenanters' discipline, it is not, however, the worse or less to be esteemed and necessary on such accounts. The maintaining of proper discipline is essential to the very existence of a Christian church, and where the prudent, tender, yet bold and impartial exercise of it is neglected, no church can long retain its purity and separation from the world, or even continue to be a church of Christ. And here a footnote. Illustrative of the character and importance of proper discipline, I subjoin a beautiful passage from Cyprian, who acknowledges he was made Bishop of Carthage by the favor and vote of all the people. It is the opening sentence of his famous treatise, which unfolds so fearfully the laxity and license which prevailed in those times, A.D. year 240, to which papists and Puseylites are so fond of appealing as the beau ideal of a right state of Christianity. The words of the sagacious father are, and here a long quote in Latin. Let degenerate churches take warning from those of Asia, once very promising. Want of proper discipline and consequent impure communion were the chief grounds of the Lord's displeasure against them, and of their melancholy rejection. And here a footnote, that from Revelation 2, verses 14 through 16. This was the radical evil in the Church of Rome also, the cause of her rejection and coming fearful destruction. Nor should it be forgotten that corrupt churches involve in their ruin the countries where they are located. When nations are to perish in their sins, 'tis in the church the leprosy begins. Hence we are glad on her account, and for the safety of the much-loved land of the sepulchres of our sainted fathers, that good and zealous ministers in the Church of Scotland are strenuously endeavouring to revive the invaluable discipline of former times.